A sad imam zadovoljstvo i čast da pozdravim gospodina Martija Keesa. On je šef misije Međunarodnog monetarnog fonda za Srbiju, a kao što znate, pre par dana misija je završila svoju redovnu posetu Srbiji, stoga je ovaj forum izuzetna prilika da čujemo kako Međunarodni monetarni fond ocenjuje do sada sprovedene reforme. Gospodine Kees, izvolite.
Let me first thank the organizers of this event for inviting me. It is definitely an honor to be here, and especially so after such distinguished guests as the Governor of the National Bank of Serbia and the Minister of Finance. In 2015, Serbia agreed with the International Monetary Fund on a program to help restore fiscal sustainability, competitiveness, and growth after a very difficult period. And in August 2018, this first program was succeeded by a new program under the PCI, the Policy Coordination Instrument, which is an arrangement without the possibility of IMF financing. Serbia's program with the IMF will end at the beginning of next year. In this presentation, I would like to focus on what we see as the main reform needs beyond this program, beyond 2020. And in this presentation, I would like to highlight some of the most critical challenges, the most critical reform needs in our eyes, so in the IMF's view. However, before looking forward, I want to quickly look back, and in particular at the last 3 years. In the slide that is showing now, you can see developments in 4 different areas over the past 15 years, which for each of them, the last column showing the results of the past 3. And what the slide shows is that growth has picked up to more than 4% last year, as was already presented, and we are projecting another 4% growth in 2020, in the current year, although I have to mention that this projection was made before the spread of the coronavirus, so that has not been incorporated in these numbers. Second, as was also presented already, in particular by the governor, inflation is low, inflation is well under control. Third, unemployment coming down. And finally, fiscal discipline has taken root. We've seen a sharp improvement in the government budget outcomes, resulting in falling public debt. So this is a good picture. It has been the result of wide-ranging reforms, and we are very glad to have been part of this process. Nonetheless, much more growth is needed. Serbia's per capita GDP is still far lower than it should be. It is below, for example, countries in the region that are part of the European Union, in Central or Southeastern Europe. And hence we are looking at what might be the key policies to ensure faster income growth, faster income convergence. As you might expect from the IMF, the first component of that is to maintain fiscal health. This is what the IMF and our programs often focus on, given that fiscal crises are often what prompt IMF support. Without fiscal health, foreign investors will stay away, domestic investors will reduce their activities for fear of future tax increases, and the government would have no room to support the economy. But of course, fiscal health alone will not be enough, and in this presentation I want to look at 3 other critical areas for making durable progress. These are emigration and demographics, infrastructure, and informality. All 4 components of policy making impact growth directly and also have important interlinkages among them. Of course, there are other areas of policy making that are also important, but in a short presentation as this, one has to make choices. So starting with the demographic side. Some 430,000 people, about 6% of the 2017 population, have emigrated from Serbia to OECD countries between 2008 and 2017. This includes many young, educated, and skilled people. A challenge that is, of course, not unique to Serbia. Other countries in the region have also faced this, given the wage differentials. And it's likely that the problem could get even worse once Serbia joins the European Union, judging from the experience in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia. In addition, this challenge is compounded by low birth rates that further reduce the size of the active population. Of course, the authorities are well aware of this. Nonetheless, the key question is what reforms would need to be taken to slow down or even reverse this trend or to offset it. Further challenge I want to mention is infrastructure. Serbia's infrastructure is improving, but there is still a large gap. Not only relative to the European Union, but also relative to Serbia's peers. In this graph, we are showing both the quality on the vertical axis and the quantity of infrastructure. Serbia is shown by the red dot. The red dot is, as you can see, close to the origin in the figure, which means that Serbia still has a long way to go. Now, there is progress recently, both in terms of road infrastructure, railway infrastructure. There are plans to do more. There's Serbia 2025, but it is starting from a low starting point. In addition to doing more, or let me phrase it differently, better infrastructure is not only directly important for growth, it has effects throughout the economy. It means more private sector development, it means more opportunities for skilled labor, and therefore better infrastructure will also have a positive impact in addressing the previous challenge I mentioned, the one of demographics. And the final challenge I wanted to focus on is the large shadow or gray economy. In a recent IMF study, we have shown the size of the gray economy across many countries. It showed Serbia with a gray economy of about 25% of total activity, coming down a little bit actually between 2015 and 2017. Serbia again is the red line in the slide. There's also other evidence, such as the size of informal unemployment, that indicate that there is some improvement, some decline in the size of the gray economy, but the size remains very large, well above, for example, EU averages. And of course, the point here is not any particular number, because there are many ways to estimate the grey economy, all of them very imprecise. Tackling informal activity is important for growth. It improves competition within the private sector. It creates more opportunities for firms to export and grow, which is very difficult for firms that are not in the formal part of the economy. And it entails access to finance, and therefore more opportunities for investment. Lower informality also can lead to more tax collection, and therefore more resources for infrastructure, for example. And by creating better living and working conditions, it can help reduce emigration. So these are some of the challenges, some of the areas to address. And from here, I want to mention some of the policy priorities that follow from it. First on our list would be to safeguard, to maintain the fiscal discipline. Serbia has achieved a very significant and important fiscal adjustment over 2014 till today. And it has managed to keep its public finances healthy in the recent budgets. The chart shows the improvement in the fiscal balance. It is the red line. The shaded area is the fiscal balance in peer countries. And so the slide shows that Serbia is now at the very higher end of fiscal balances among its peers. This has created fiscal space. And it is, of course, important to use this space wisely, for example, for investment rather than for current expenditures. But most of all, it is critical to safeguard prudent budgeting going forward, beyond the current program with the IMF. This means a need to create and to strengthen mechanisms to underpin fiscal discipline. There will be many pressures on the budget to spend more on infrastructure, wages, pensions, and much more. This is why implementing and strengthening fiscal rules is important. Fiscal rules were introduced in 2012 and were violated almost from the start. That, of course, should not happen when new fiscal rules, when improved fiscal rules are put in place. They should be durable. They should be actually guiding fiscal policy. In addition, there's a need for a transparent wage system and a need for rules that ensure that employment within the public sector stays within budget limits. Creating all these systems is an important task for the current year to make sure that fiscal discipline will be maintained going forward. Moving on to the demographic challenge. There has been some recent work by the IMF about the impact of the demographic shifts across Eastern and Southeastern Europe. What this work shows is that the demographic shifts will lead to lower growth rates across the entire region. The adverse population dynamics are mainly the result of low birth rates, high mortality rates, but of course also the outward migration. For the region as a whole, the average annual GDP growth over the period from 2020 to 2050, so a long period, would be lower about 1.2 percentage points, which means over the whole period, a decline in output by more than 30% relative to what would happen without this kind of demographic shift. Now, in this slide, Serbia is the second bar from the left. You can see that Serbia is actually less affected than other countries in the region. This is because the outlook for its labor supply and productivity are relatively better than for other countries. But even then, it shows that we project for Serbia a negative impact on growth of 0.8 percentage points per year. Still very significant. What can Serbia do to address this? One option is to work on increasing labor force participation. Along with other Western Balkan countries, Serbia has a low labor force participation rate still, relative to other parts of Europe. We spell out a moderate reform scenario, which is shown by the blue dots, a moderate reform scenario in which we assume that female labor force participation can be raised to Western European standards, and that retirement ages can increase in line with life expectancy, although not above 67 years of age. The result? For Serbia, the negative impact on growth, which otherwise would be 0.8 percentage point per year, would be reduced to 0.6. In addition, in this scenario, we also found that the negative impact of the demographic shock on the fiscal deficit of about 2.5 percentage points over the period as a whole would be more than offset. We also elaborated a more ambitious reform scenario for the labor market, that's the yellow shock, in which these effects are even larger. And of course, increasing labor market participation is not the only reform to reduce the impact of demographic shocks. The government has initiated policies to promote immigration of labor, in particular return migration, which can help. The Fiscal Council has stressed the impact of stronger institutions in reducing the appeal of the possibility of leaving the country. Then a third priority, closing the infrastructure gap. Closing infrastructure gaps would generate significant growth and accelerate income convergence. According to IMF simulations, reducing the infrastructure gap by 20 percentage points would generate higher GDP growth across the region of typically about 0.2 or 0.3 percentage points per year. And in Serbia's case, the impact would be even larger. We would estimate a gain that could be as large as 0.5 percentage point. Our baseline projection for growth over the medium term is 4%. So closing infrastructure gaps could raise that to 4.5. How do you do that? Well, first, of course, making sure that the budget has the room for a high capital spending allocation, which depends on fiscal space. But it also requires strengthening public investment management to make sure that projects have the right quality. And we do hope that the new public investment management system that was introduced last year will be used for all projects, for rigorous evaluation to help ensure value for money across all investment projects. And the final area I want to highlight is continuing to improve the business climate, noting that the payoff from doing so is especially high when at the start informality is high, as is the case, for example, in Serbia. The logic is that business climate reforms facilitate, encourage companies to move into the formal sector. And that really pays off in terms of GDP growth. In this chart, we illustrate that for 3 different types of business climate reforms. These are numbers based on our last year's World Economic Outlook from October. And these are results across emerging economies, so not only for Serbia. And they distinguish countries with lower, medium, or higher informality. And what does this study show? Take, for example, domestic finance, the block in the slide on the left. It shows that improving access to domestic finance is good for growth, of course. That's what one would expect. Companies can invest more. But it also shows that in countries with high informality, this beneficial effect is much larger. Why? It not only gives countries across the board more access to finance, but it also pulls companies into the formal sector, because that's where you can get access to finance. And by pulling them into the formal sector, these companies also have opportunities, for example, to export. They have opportunities to benefit from schemes to promote research and development. It becomes a bigger benefit because it pulls companies into the formal sector. And that is true not only for reforms to improve access to finance, the same is true for reforms that make the labor market more flexible, or, for example, reforms that reduce corruption. All reforms that are good anyway for all countries, but in countries where they can reduce informality the most, they pay off even more. So in all, what would be the takeaways from my brief presentation? The first, in order to raise growth even further, reforms are needed across a range of areas, including to keep the public finances strong. Second, that these reforms are very much interrelated and can reinforce each other. For example, labor market reforms to offset the demographic shock will also strengthen the budget. And by strengthening the budget, they create fiscal space for public investment. And finally, an overarching theme for all the priority reforms that I mentioned is that they all relate to stronger governance. Governance of the budget, for example, through effective fiscal rules. Governance of public investment with a strong public investment management system. And governance of businesses by fighting the grey economy and corruption. The current program that the government has with the International Monetary Fund will come to an end after this year. But the reform agenda continues. We at the IMF look forward to continuing our support for policies that will lead to high and sustainable economic growth. Thank you.